Okay, hello everyone. I don't know if everyone needs like a 30-second breather between the last panel and this panel, but I'm sure we have um, people joining us right now as well. So I'll just start with framing us a little bit. Thank you to everyone who's joining us for the first virtual summit on deepfake abuse. I'm so grateful to everyone who's organized this because it's such an important topic right now. So for this specific panel, we're going to be getting a bit into what that landscape looks like of deepfake abuse. What does it mean to investigate deepfake abuse? What is the internet culture around intimate image abuse, especially as this technology sort of evolves in this accelerated manner, that landscape is also changing at a very fast pace. And so for that conversation, I'm joined by some incredible panelists, including two very badass journalists. I have with us Kat Tenbarge, who's currently working as a tech and culture reporter at NBC News. She's done some incredible work on internet culture, influencers, but also the business side and platform side of deepfake abuse. So we'll be speaking to her about that. And then we also have Sam Cole, who is, again, another incredible journalist, co-founder of 404 Media, and has just done so much reporting in the tech space and broken so many stories about specifically intimate image and deepfake abuse. So we're really lucky to have both of them. And I'm really happy to be on a panel once again with Sophie Compton, who is just the brilliant director of Another Body, which not only interrogates deepfake abuse, but also sort of takes ownership of that technology in an interesting new way on how it could actually aid survivors and those trying to, get their power back after going through something as traumatizing and destabilizing as intimate image abuse. Oh, and I'm Fatima. I'm here from Witness. We're a video and human rights organization, and generative AI, synthetic media, and of course, deepfakes have lots of human rights impacts and are also figuring out how to confront abuse of these technologies as an integral part of our work. So I'm really excited to have this conversation and learn from these incredible panelists and see what we can think about together. So to kick us off, Sam, I'm going to start with you. It would be, since you've been investigating this for a really long time and you've been in these spaces before the technology evolved to the space that it has today, it would be really great to just get a sense from you, an overview of like the landscape of deepfake abuse and intimate image abuse, how you've seen it evolve in the time that you've been investigating it. What did those original Reddit threads look like? What was the process then? What does it look like now? Just anything that you'd like to share on that.
Yeah, it's been a wild 6 or 7 years. It's crazy that that's how long it's been since we first wrote the story about deepfakes. The first time I wrote about deepfakes, there wasn't a name for it yet. It wasn't called deepfakes, so it's like the headline has, it's not like deepfakes this and that. It's mentioned as a Redditor's username. So yeah, back then, this was late 2017. What it took to make a deepfake was a big data set of lots of high quality images. So, hundreds to thousands of images of someone's face. Usually these were clipped from like an interview or like a high quality recording of like a celebrity, because that's readily available out there online. And then you would need a pretty decent gaming setup, like a PC that could run that kind of hardware, and a decent amount of knowledge into like engineering and machine learning. So, you had to have a lot of time and patience, and, the ability to kind of troubleshoot and work through some of the issues that came up. And this sounds like a lot of barriers to entry to us today. We'll get into why that is, but at the time, it's consumer level at that point. It's something that only like Hollywood studios had been doing. And it was something that you needed like huge budget and special effects artists to be able to do convincingly. And here was someone just posting their AI hobby on Reddit, on like porn subreddits. So that's where this started. It started on Reddit, where people were they were already making doppelganger photos, like photoshopped of nude celebrities, and this person took it to the next level of video. So yeah, the way it's evolved in the last few years, and we talked about this kind of early on too, and it's what experts told me in the early days, was it's going to immediately become way faster, way cheaper, way easier to do. And that's definitely been the case. Just to kind of rush forward 7 years, I guess. Nowadays, I remember when it was like a big deal when you could do one shot or two shot deep fakes. And now you can do just like an app with a poorly lit selfie. And you can make a pretty convincing deep fake that way. I made a bunch the other day, just like experimenting with some of the apps that are out there on the app stores. And, I was doing pretty high quality deep fakes from my phone in like 3 minutes for $1. So it's evolved quite a bit. It's very different than in what it used to be. And, now we're seeing high schoolers, accessing these apps from TikTok and things like that. So yeah, it's a very different world than it was. And also the same problems are happening at the same time. So yeah.
No, that's really helpful because I mean, at Witness as well, one of the things that we've been thinking about is just the sheer volume that's out there now and the ease with which anyone can sort of make something, relatively sophisticated with these technologies, compared to even like 3 years back. It's just shifting at such a rate. And so even when we're thinking about how do we measure the impact of this, trying to just contend with the volume of what's out there is so difficult. And with that, I kind of want to turn to you, Sophie, because I know you have your hands on some really interesting quantitative and qualitative research on what that landscape looks like now and what's out there. And I know this is like not a lot of research has actually been done in a very sort of targeted way. So, and I know during the course of making your film, you were also investigating these sort of avenues, how people were making deepfakes and how it was affecting, students and like really like young, both young survivors, but also perpetrators getting their hands on this kind of technology. So I would just love for you to talk a little bit, like going off what Sam said, talk a little bit more about what that landscape looks like now and what you've seen and what research you have.
Yeah, I mean, I shared a little bit of this in the opening remarks, so apologies for people that might get a bit of repeat information, but I think it's so important to restate for the people that haven't, that like, yeah, the level at which this has exploded. So we've been working with an amazing researcher called Genevieve O, who's basically been tracking like all of the apps that have been coming up, and she's like, so she's got in time since these apps have only really been around, the apps that allow you to make to nudify, to like strip images, or to like make deepfakes with like one image, so really lowering the barrier to entry. They've only really been around for the last like year-ish, but now there are like over 300. There's hundreds of Telegram like bots. And the graph, like if anyone wants to see the graphs, like get in touch for the My Image, My Choice dossier, because they're pretty extraordinary. And the graph is like a curve that basically becomes vertical. And the point is that like without any accountability, without any legislation, like that's not going to change. So yeah, the number of views on deepfake sites is now over 4 billion. And the stat that I think is so helpful to frame that I mentioned at the beginning of the summit was that there have been more videos posted, there were more videos posted in 2023 than in every other year in history combined. So I feel like that's, something that I'm really passionate about, in understanding like how, as you say, Fatima, like how do we grasp what that actually means? Is this question of the normalization that we're seeing in the fact that this is now something that people are doing in the schoolyard without, as Noelle said as well earlier, without necessarily even realizing that this is a bad thing. Like, the lines have been blurred so much in terms of consent, in terms of what is consensual, what is abusive material. Like, the fact that it's still being called deepfake porn when it's not porn, it's a form of digital sexual abuse. You know, these are all factors, and the way that these sites have presented themselves as almost like an offshoot of the porn industry, where this is not pornography. Like, that is a profession. This is, you know, this is an abusive practice, which is a completely different thing. What that's done is that that's meant that people are sharing these around with their friends without even realizing, and just trying out the apps, and there's this like cultural acceptability around it now, which is really scary. And I think that we need to think about these sites as, we need to think about what that's doing to the expectations for young women and the expectations for young men. And there was something that I read recently that I thought was so interesting in the UK, which was that Gen Z young men are more likely than boomer men to believe that feminism has done more harm than good. And I do believe that the deepfake creation sites are spaces of radicalization. And that's something that we've seen in, you know, in working and following some of the stories of the creators as well as of the victims, and how people get pulled into this world, and how their norms and their expectations around gender therefore shifts. And I do think that deepfakes, as well as the rise of people like Andrew Tate, etc., are really a significant factor in that split that we're seeing in the younger generation.
I think I would love actually for both Sam, possibly if you have something to add, and Sophie, to speak a little bit more about this. Like, what are we seeing in the way that, because it's very easy, I think, when you're on the outside to be like, of course, that's atrocious, what's going on. And especially as women, it's quite easy to like feel how like horrific that kind of violation would feel. But in terms of the culture and the space that creators and what's happening in these discords and these like Reddit forums and Telegram channels, maybe either Sam or Sophie, maybe you could speak a little bit more to like what that culture is about. I remember in our prep call, I think Sophie, you mentioned a very interesting conversation that people were having about, like, for example, copyright. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more from both of you on that space that's being created.
Do you want to go first, Sam?
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's so I could talk forever about the idea that deepfakes are a social problem just as much, if not more, as they are a technological or legislative one. The social problems that are at play here are much harder to solve than any of the technological issues, and the technological issues are really hard. So it's like, you know, can you even imagine how to begin to address some of this? But the entitlement that is at play here is really astounding, and it's been the most consistent through line that I've seen in my reporting since the very beginning. The first, you know, the original user deepfakes, when I asked him, you know, was he worried about things like, you know, abuse of this technology or blackmail or, you know, quote unquote revenge porn, the response was, you know, it's something that someone's going to do eventually. So no, like, any technology can be used for harm and for good. And that's something that every single person that I've ever talked to who makes deepfakes says. If they're not, you know, actively like, I'm trying to harass and be malicious, you know, it's always like, well, I'm innovating on this because someone's going to eventually, so why not me? And it's also the root of this very much is stigma against sex workers, in my opinion, because the worst thing that you can be in the eyes of society is a sex worker. That's why this level of harassment is effective. And it's why it's the first thing that's a lot of the times these guys will go for, is, you know, faking putting you in that position without your consent. So, I mean, these are all, we could talk about things like consent education and sex education, and the lack thereof. I would very much like to see some legislative power behind those type of issues. But there's this push right now against those things happening in schools that's really, really powerful and really strong. So I think people take the technological route more readily than some of the social problems at play. So yeah, I mean, and the copyright thing is a whole other can of worms. I would really like to hear what's going on there from Sophie.
Well, the copyright thing is like it's quite a specific example because yeah, something that really, when me and Ruben spent we're researching for the film and like spent a lot of time in these forums, one of the things that we saw time and time again, well, one of the things that really struck us was how they were operating as like, we assumed male, it seemed that's all the evidence pointed towards it, but you don't 100% know, but like male social bonding spaces. And there was a lot like in and amongst the like bickering and infighting and people falling out and people like cursing each other with the most horrendously racist, homophobic, ableist, misogynistic language. There were also these pockets of like support and like brotherhood and affection. And so there was a lot of like, yeah, thank you, man. Like, you're doing this for the culture. Like, we'll support you. Like, and I think that that's something that we need to look at. Like, what is it? Why is it that people are finding community in this space and finding community based on what Sam said, like the entitlement? But yeah, one of the things that within that kind of complex landscape of communication, the thing that seemed to really drive people apart was this sense of people copying other people's deepfaking style. So we saw these mad conversations where it's like, that's like this my source video trademark, or like I go for that fetish, or like I do this, and this like anger between like different deepfakers. And also there was a lot of critique of different deepfakers, like failure to make good deepfakes originally. But obviously what that copyright conversation completely ignores is the fact that the real violation here is not whether your deepfaking style has been copied, but it's, you know, the images of the two women who are being whose consent is being violated, both the target, the face, and also, like as you rightly mentioned, the sex worker whose, you know, profession, who's been rendered just a body as well. So yeah, one other thing that I wanted to, you know, I completely agree that this word entitlement is so key. And I think that one of the contradictions that we've seen a lot in these spaces is that, yes, on one hand, there's this massive minimization and downplaying of like, it's not even real, it's not a big deal, it was going to happen anyway, like, what do you expect? You can't stop people from doing what they want on the internet, all that kind of stuff. But then on the other hand, there is also that real awareness that this can be weaponized to shut people up, to strike people down. It is a tool of harassment. And I think that those like two justifications, you know, the internal contradictions are so clear when you go on these forums. And but the thing that does connect both of those things is entitlement. And the final thing I wanted to mention as well is that I think one of the things that makes this really hard to combat in terms of policy and legislation is that, like, basically lawmakers just don't understand the language, and I think also especially like the role of satire and humor. And so much of these spaces is like downplaying people that care too much, like don't be a normie or be a simp, like caring too much, putting too much effort in, feeling emotions, like all of those things are being, you know, ripped apart. And that 4chan is like a meme factory. And I just think that in a way that like minimization, that's all a form of the minimization. And what really depresses me is that minimization is then recreated across society by police, by lawmakers, by the people that kind of question whether this is like actually significant. But I also think that like we just have people of a very different generation who just don't have that like language, and therefore it's quite, I think that they can seem like these very obscure spaces. So yeah, I think that the role of humor weirdly is something that has been really under recognized in trying to address this problem.
Yeah, and there's so many threads that I want to pull from everything both of you have said. But even it's so interesting, like, for example, the copyright conversation, because there actually is a real sort of like intellectual property violation there, but it's not the one that they think is, right? Because there's like it's the property of the original sex worker or person who made like the video being used in a certain way without consent as well. And what Kat said about like, sorry, not what Kat, what Sam said about the social and technical problems both existing, like even this minimization, like we're thinking about not just what's happening in online spaces, but like an entire history of sexual violence against women being minimized, and like this being like a different iteration in an online space. And everything that you're saying about like legislation and policy, I want to get back to. But before we get to that, to get like a better understanding, I want to turn to you, Kat, because, you know, we've been mentioning Telegram channels, we've been mentioning like Reddit, channels, we've been mentioning like so many different platforms. And then at the beginning when Sam was talking about how she recently, you know, paid like $3 to be able to make a deepfake, we're also talking about money. And you've done like really great work on the business of deepfaking and how different tech companies and, for example, financial companies and platforms are all like in the net that sort of like makes this possible. So I'd love to hear from you about that landscape and what's going on there.
Absolutely. And I think that everything that everyone has said so far is so important and so profound. And I think we can't unravel this without looking at the social aspect and the aspect of misogyny and the history of sexual violence that powers the entire evolution of this practice. When I first started looking into deepfakes, it was really at the beginning of 2023. So years past the point where the technology had begun to evolve to reach this point. What put it on my radar is sort of the cultural watershed moment in a bad way in January 2023, when a major Twitch streamer revealed that he was looking at deepfakes of some of his female peers. And as soon as that controversy erupted, it struck me as the moment where a lot of this was going to be mainstreamed to a much bigger audience. Because as Sam was discussing, you know, when you're looking at these sort of niche communities at sort of the beginning of like the deepfake space and the deepfake community, a lot of times they're on more niche platforms. Even Reddit, which is a massive social media platform, is still considered more niche than like Facebook or Instagram. But what we see now is that all of this stuff has since migrated to these mainstream social media platforms. And so now we're seeing individual AI generated images that depict non-consensual, sexually suggestive or sexually explicit scenes featuring identifiable people. We're seeing those go viral on mainstream platforms. And so with these mainstream platforms, a lot of times there is a monetization factor involved. Like, for example, when we saw the Taylor Swift deepfake AI generated images, when we saw those go viral on Twitter, it's like there were so many accounts with blue checks reposting them. And the way that that monetization scheme works is like if other blue checks reply to you, their views then translate over into small but still existing amounts of money. But what was really concerning, which Genevieve O's research again helped point us in this direction, was on some of the really big deepfake video hosting platforms. When we went and looked at the profiles of the individual creators, they would have links to their Discord accounts, or they would have links to this website that was powered, that allowed credit card transactions with Visa and MasterCard. And when you see this, it's such an immediate knee-jerk reaction of like, are you kidding me? Because as people like Sam have reported for years, these credit card companies and these payment processors have long discriminated against people who engage in consensual sex work, but they are powering and enabling and very complicit, literally, in the creation of non-consensual deepfake sexual abuse that is created under the guise of being similar to pornography, but at the end of the day, it's not. So we found a lot of these deepfake creators were able to earn income that way. And then in addition to that, there's the crypto element. So a lot of people take in a lot of money through their crypto wallets, and that is even more difficult, I think, to both regulate and keep track of and sort of chase down, because it's such a constantly shifting and technologically sophisticated space. With Visa and MasterCard, when we did our article, we reached out to them and we never heard back from them. And I just think that that is so indicative of the way that tech companies and large major companies who should be leading the way on this issue have instead just ignored how complicit they are and how they've allowed it to reach this point.
Thank you so much for that. My follow-up question to you was going to be like, oh, have we heard anything from them? And then you said, yourself that like they never responded. So like over here, you start thinking about there's so many levels at which this needs to be attacked, right? There's the social level, there's the technical level, there's the generators, there's the platforms on which they're shared, there's the financial sort of routes through which the money is being passed. So this is this is something like, even in terms of like just thinking about the impact of deepfakes, like we've been thinking about different solutions at Witness for like synthetic media that's or deepfakes. And in my like, I've only recently been in this space, but I see that so many of the solutions are thinking about like authenticity and verification and being able to tell whether video is fake or whether a video is real. And one of the things that's so hard about deepfake abuse is that authenticity or verification doesn't mitigate the harm, right? Like everyone could know that it's a fake video and it's still a violation and it's still non-consensual and it can still destroy someone's life. In fact, it's very like often I don't think creators are claiming that those videos are real or trying to even pass them off as real. So if we start thinking about, okay, how do we confront this? This is kind of for everyone, but I guess I want to start with you, Sophie, because I know you've been trying to like do a lot of advocacy and think about legislative and policy changes. So I kind of have a two-part question. I'd love to hear from everyone on what they think, like what's happening in the sort of legislative policy space or even advocacy to tech companies and these sort of like financial companies. But because this panel is about stories and investigating the sort of landscape, what role also do you think like the investigative work that both like all three of you have done and the stories that you've uncovered, like what role do you think they're playing in like getting legislators to understand what's going on and also trying to figure out, okay, what solutions make sense and what ones don't actually address the issue that we're confronted with?
Yeah, I think that the investigative reporting on this has been literally transformational. And one reason is that it is a really evolving landscape. So even just having that data around the Nudify apps means that we can then highlight that that's a problem and we can highlight that and bring it up. And I think that, for example, I really noticed that when Kat's piece about the business landscape of deepfake was published. It's something that we've been trying to communicate for a while and literally no one was getting it, like that this is shocking, that it's completely unacceptable. For example, like one, I hinted at it earlier on, and a big a big piece of Genevieve's research is around Google and is around Google's not just the way that Google is servicing this content and driving people to this content and linking deepfake sites. It's not being considered harmful content like child sex abuse material is. It is visible. It's not just that. Google is also driving users who have not even searched for deepfake pornography themselves towards this content, who, like, if you were to search for the name of a prominent female politician and thoughts on deepfakes, you will pull up non-consensual intimate image abuse of them, etc. And that is something that we had been noticing and we've been so frustrated by, but actually it's when mainstream media outlets and when cutting edge reports reframe this as something that we need to care about and give people like the language and terminology to understand what is going on. That's when people suddenly realize this is really a big deal, but I think that intellectual work really has been essential.
Mm-hmm. Over here, Kat, I want to come to you for a second because we were talking about different cases and stories that shift the narrative and conversation on deepfake abuse. And we were talking about like if there's any notable case studies or stories that have come up recently. And I'd love for you to share what you were talking about in terms of celebrity images and age.
Yes. Yes. So this is something I've found that a lot of the deepfake, not all of them, but some of them, you just wind up stumbling across them in the wild. Like I was just searching on Google and Bing for news coverage related to the high school incidents that we've been seeing pop up all around the world. And in the process of typing in terms related to deepfakes, all of this very disturbing content started being surfaced to me in like the very top results. So that's problem number one. Is these search engine companies, they talk about how their results are calibrated so that users aren't seeing shocking or disturbing content that they're not looking for. But in the cases of deepfakes, that is not true, because even if you're just innocuously looking for news coverage, in this case, the term that I put in and that my editor actually put in was just like fake nude photos. And when we searched that, not only was there a lot of non-consensual deepfakes of adult actresses, but I noticed that their faces in some of these deepfake photos looked very young. And it really alarmed me because a lot of them were like Disney Channel actresses. So there's tons of material out there from before they actually turned 18. And the way that I went about doing this was I just screenshotted the faces and then did reverse image searches. And because a lot of times these were deepfakes from years back, the materials that people were sourcing them from were like Getty photos, which are things that are actually cataloged in these reverse image search in like the data that they pull from. So I could match them up and tell that actually these were deep fakes featuring children's faces. And so that stuff is being surfaced to the very top. And so that's really concerning. And I think there is kind of a difficulty sometimes in assessing, especially if the person in question is an adult now, you can't immediately know the age of the person in the photo. But that was just a recent example of something where I was like, we're clearly, like Bing, for example, is like years behind on dealing with this, because these images have been circulating in Bing search results for like 10 years in some cases. So it just goes to show that, like you were talking about, Sophie, the reframing of this as like, this is something we really need to be paying attention to now. It is also effective because a lot of lawmakers and policymakers and people who have these big decision-making roles, they still get the majority of their news from like mainstream or worker-owned in some cases, like 404. They're still reading articles. A lot of people on the internet get their news through social media posts, which is fine and great and wonderful. But when it comes to people in Congress, for example, they're more likely going to cite an article from the New York Times or something similar than they are going to see viral tweets about this issue.
Mm-hmm. Sam, I was wondering if you'd like to jump in on, again, just thinking about the stories that you're investigating. You know what I'd love to like know over there in terms of linking both the stories that you're investigating as well as the sort of advocacy push and trying to get legislators to take this seriously. Now that there's just so much out there, what is like your process? How do you decide what's like what you want to highlight right now? And or is it like you coming across a story, coming across a thread, following it? I know, like, Kat, you mentioning the age thing is really important because it's unfortunate because they should take all deepfake abuse seriously. But like, for example, recently there's been a push to take it more seriously, just thinking about how easy it makes the abuse of images of children. And so just thinking about the various angles that we're like pushing at this from, Sam, I wonder if there was something that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of everything above what you just described. I mean, it's like a lot of the time it is jumping on something that everyone's talking about. So for example, with the Taylor Swift stuff, it's like everyone was, that was massively viral, but at the same time, it requires being in these spaces and at the level of the people making them and like the people who actually creating the content. So to use that story as an example, it's like we were already in the Telegram chats where these were being made before they even went viral on Twitter. So like when they did go viral, when the mainstream saw it, we knew exactly where they were coming from, which was, I think that one was designer from Microsoft, but yeah, it was like, we recognize the image style. So it's kind of a blend of like, okay, we're watching something happening, we're kind of like, okay, here's what we're keeping an eye on. And then waiting for it to really break through to a wider audience, because that's when, people will actually pay attention, unfortunately. So yeah, and you also don't want to boost this stuff too early, because then you'll end up with people going to that Telegram, finding that on their own. So it's a little bit of both. Yeah.
But I think that example just shows how important it is for people to be doing that like long-term work and having that larger overview, because I don't imagine anybody else could have recognized like the deepfake style and like known where it was coming from unless they had, been in that space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes left. So I wanna try to get one audience question in, and then maybe give you all like a second to say any last thoughts about where you think everything is going next. But we have a question from Erica, which says, how to make sure that tech solutions and legislation do not respond to sexual expression, censorship, and morality arguments, rather than addressing prioritizing consent. We have seen how sex workers are harmed in the process to suppress and even basic access to sexuality info for the LGBTQ community. Appreciate that you are recognizing that sex worker rights are also being violated in this process. So if anybody would like to take that.
One thing I do want to say in response to that, I think this is a really important thing to consider, and something that has kind of disturbed me in the process of a lot of this reporting is when I've reached out to some of these big tech companies to send them, here are 30 tweets, or here are 10 Facebook posts, or whatever platform it is. And it's like, do you have comment on this? Are you planning to do anything about this? These examples that we found. A lot of times when they take that content down, almost universally, the reasoning does not have to do with the non-consensual aspect of the material. The reasoning is that it violates rules around sexually explicit content. And that is super concerning to me. I've also done reporting, and I know Sam has too, about how social media companies unfairly target and penalize sex workers, but also, in addition to sex workers, sex educators. There's, a part about LGBTQ access to education. A lot of times when we try to clear the internet of all sexually explicit content, we end up taking away life-saving resources and life-saving information for the most marginalized people among us. It can actually do more harm than good if these types of policies are enforced broadly and sweep up tons of people who are just freely expressing themselves in the process. So one thing that I think really does need to shift is looking at this material as what it is, which is non-consensual sexual abuse, versus just looking at it as something that's sexually explicit, so we can't have it in our Google search results. And then I think the other part of that is a lot of these tech companies like Google, for example, will say that they don't yet have regulations around the deepfake content itself. Like they're still relying on these other kind of rules and policies because they're like, oh, we're waiting to see how the conversation evolves. And it's like, you have to drive the conversation just like you're driving all these people to these websites. Like you have to take responsibility for your oversized, outsized role in this crisis.
And I think please go ahead, Sophie.
No, I just wanted to applaud, but also to say that what's insane is that we're allowing tech companies to write their own risk assessments and regulation. Like that is the piece that is missing. And that's where that crafting of how do we balance the necessary free expression. For example, I believe that there's a huge issue around Microsoft GitHub, but I also think that needs to be balanced with access to really exciting new code for not just researchers and journalists, but also artists, also, creators, blah, blah, et cetera. That is the kind of balanced conversation that needs to be had, but that's the kind of conversation that needs to be had by policymakers. And then those frameworks need to be required and enforced on the tech companies. At the moment, and this is something, someone mentioned the Digital Services Act in the UK, in the EU, and there's also the Online Safety Bill in the UK. Like, all great, we need regulation, as Noelle said, but who's the people that are writing that regulation currently are the tech companies, and they are not going to be doing it in the way that is that's not most favorable to them. Yeah, I had one tiny thing. Do we have time for one more point or not? No.
Yeah, I was going to ask what next, and I feel like you and Kat have already gone there. So maybe Sophie, you can say what you want to say, and we can wrap up with Sam on like a final note.
Perfect. Yeah, really quickly, something that I noticed that I thought was really interesting when me and Ruben managed to get access to a private deepfaker kind of chat in around 2019, and at that moment, that was when it was going, it's like Reddit and some other spaces were saying that they were going to take action on deepfakes, and that community was running scared, and everyone was saying there's no way they're going to let us get away with this. The anti-freedom of expression people are going to be coming for us. Like, this whole situation could have gone so differently, and still now we have the potential to completely change, to make this huge explosion, put the genie back in the box. People are still going to do it, but the mainstreaming of it is not inevitable. It's insane.
Sam, I'll give you the last minute if you wanna round us off.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would agree that like it's not, I think a lot of the times we treat technology, especially when it's really big and scary and harmful like this, that it's inevitable. And it's kind of like, well, we have to mitigate the harms, and then, what's left is what's left. And yeah, I generally reject that idea. I think we can be more optimistic than that. We can imagine better things for ourselves for the future. To end it on as little as of a bleak note as possible, I guess. Usually when I talk about this stuff, I'm like, it's not all doomed. We'll be okay. But, we have to actually talk about it and be loud about it to make it that way.
Yeah.
So I appreciate spaces like this where we can do that.
No, thank you all so much. We have such lovely comments in the Q&A about all of you and everything that you've said as well. I'm sorry for everyone whose questions we couldn't get to. We're really just out of time. But thank you, Sam, Kat, Sophie. I'm so glad we were able to have this conversation together. And thank you for organizing this summit. Like, this is such an important conversation for all of us to have, to be able to push forward on all of the fronts that everybody has mentioned.